You know what's strange? When you learn about World War II in school, they tell you about D-Day, they tell you about Patton's dash across France, they tell you about the Battle of the Bulge, but they don't tell you about the moment a 17-year-old former Hitler Youth member had his entire worldview shattered by a black American sergeant teaching him English during lunch breaks. They don't tell you about the drivers hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing things that weren't there, yet somehow keeping 6,000 trucks moving. They don't tell you about the price that was paid by men who came home to an America that still wouldn't let them sit at the front of the bus. This is part 2 of the Red Ball Express story, and if you haven't watched part 1 yet, go back and watch it now, because what I'm about to tell you won't make sense without understanding what these men accomplished. But if you're here, if you stuck with me, grab that coffee, settle in, because we're about to go deeper into the story that changed everything about how wars are fought and how America saw itself. Before we start, make sure you're subscribed, because these are the stories that matter, the ones they don't put in the textbooks, the real history that explains how we got here, all right? Now here's something the textbooks don't usually tell you: the impact of the Red Ball Express on racial attitudes in the military. See, the operation's success depended overwhelmingly on men who were still being treated as second-class citizens, not just in the South, but throughout America. These were soldiers who couldn't vote in many states, who faced Jim Crow laws, who were told implicitly and explicitly that they were inferior. And yet they were performing miracles of logistics that the supposedly superior German military couldn't comprehend, let alone replicate. There were moments during the Red Ball operation that forced white officers to confront their own prejudices. A colonel from Georgia watching a black sergeant organize a convoy loading that cut the time by 40%. A major from Mississippi seeing black drivers volunteer for another 20-hour shift when everyone was beyond exhausted. A general from Texas reading efficiency reports showing that predominantly black truck companies had better performance records than white companies. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How do you maintain belief in racial hierarchy when the evidence in front of your eyes contradicts it every single day? One white officer, a captain named Robert Miller from Pennsylvania, he wrote in his diary in September 1944, and this diary is now in the National Archives. I grew up believing certain things about colored people, that they were lazy, couldn't handle responsibility, needed supervision for every task. I've spent 2 weeks with the Red Ball Express. Everything I believed was wrong. These men work harder than any soldiers I've seen. They make decisions faster and better than officers I know. They've earned something more than what we give them. Not every white officer had that realization. Some maintained their prejudices despite the evidence. But enough did that it created pressure, created momentum for change that wouldn't come for another few years, but was inevitable after what happened in France. The German prisoners working alongside black soldiers, loading trucks, repairing roads, that created its own kind of education. Many of these prisoners were young men, teenagers really, who'd been indoctrinated their entire adolescence with Nazi racial ideology. They'd been told that Aryans were superior, that other races were Untermensch, subhuman. Then they found themselves taking orders from black sergeants who spoke German, who were educated, who treated them more fairly than their own officers had. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. One prisoner, a former Hitler Youth member named Klaus Berger, was interviewed decades later. He said, "I was 17 when I was captured. I believed everything they'd taught me. Then I worked with the Red Ball for 3 months as a laborer. The black soldiers, they gave me food when they didn't have to. They talked to me like a person, not a prisoner. One sergeant, he found out I was trying to learn English. He spent his breaks teaching me. I couldn't reconcile that with what I'd been taught. It broke something in my mind, in a good way. I realized everything I'd believed about race was a lie." Stories like that, multiplied across thousands of prisoners, helped deprogram a generation of young Germans from Nazi ideology more effectively than any Allied propaganda could have. But let's talk about the mechanics of the operation itself, because the ingenuity, It went beyond just driving trucks fast and far. The Americans developed systems, workarounds, innovations that German engineers studied after the war with something approaching awe. Take the fuel management system. Every 25 miles along the Red Ball route, there was a fuel dump. But these weren't traditional fuel depots with pumps and procedures and paperwork. They were essentially giant fields of jerry cans and tanker trucks. A driver pulled in, other drivers and support personnel swarmed the truck, filled it in less than 10 minutes, and the driver was back on the road. No signing for fuel, no checking credentials. The assumption was, if you're driving a truck on the Red Ball route, you need fuel, here it is, go. This violated every principle of military accountability. German quartermasters would have had heart attacks watching it. Where was the inventory control? How did they prevent theft? How did they track consumption? The American answer? They didn't care. Fuel was so abundant that waste was irrelevant. Better to lose 10% to inefficiency and theft than to lose time on procedures. Time was the precious commodity, not fuel. The Germans had never fought a war where any resource was more abundant than time. They couldn't adapt their thinking to this reality. Or consider vehicle maintenance. Traditional military doctrine says you maintain vehicles carefully, track every part, rebuild engines, maximize the lifespan of every truck. The Red Ball Express threw that out entirely. Mobile maintenance units would assess a broken truck in 5 minutes. Can it be fixed quickly? Fix it. Will it take more than 15 minutes? Push it off the road, cannibalize it for parts, move on. There were stretches of the Red Ball route where you could walk for miles on abandoned American trucks, dozens of them, hundreds eventually. German officers observing this were horrified. The waste, one wrote, the criminal waste of material. But it wasn't waste, it was prioritization. A truck that broke down was less valuable than the time it would take to recover it properly. Pushing it off the road and replacing it kept the system flowing. That was more important than the truck. This is the mathematics of abundance versus the mathematics of scarcity. The Germans were playing a different game, and they didn't realize it until too late. The Red Ball routes themselves evolved constantly. The original route from Scharberg to Chartres, that was just the beginning. As the front moved east, as supply requirements changed, new routes appeared like capillaries branching from arteries. The White Ball Express from Rouen to Paris, established in 72 hours when Paris needed supply after liberation. The Green Diamond from Scharberg to railheads, moving supplies to where trains could take over. The Red Lion from Bayeux to Brussels once Belgium was liberated. The ABC route, Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi, when the port of Antwerp finally opened. Each route had its own color-coded markers, its own support infrastructure, and its own pool of drivers, and each was operational within 48 hours of the decision to create it. The speed of implementation baffled German planners. In the Wehrmacht, creating a new supply route required weeks of planning. Staff meetings, reconnaissance, engineering assessments, resource allocation, command approvals up and down the chain. The Americans just did it. A colonel would decide a new route was needed, engineers would survey it in a day, signs would go up, fuel dumps would be established, maintenance stations would appear, trucks would start rolling. It was chaos that somehow produced order. Or maybe it was order that looked like chaos to people trained in rigid military hierarchy. The human cost of the Red Ball Express. It's something we should linger on for a moment. Because behind all these statistics, these tons and miles and gallons, there were men, mostly young men, many of them barely out of their teens. 300 drivers died, not from enemy action mostly, from accidents, from exhaustion, from vehicles overturning on damaged roads, from collisions in fog, from trucks whose brakes failed after too many hours of operation. There's a cemetery in Normandy, the Brittany American Cemetery, where some of these men are buried. Headstones that say Quartermaster Corps instead of infantry or armor. but they died in service just as surely as any combat soldier. And thousands more were injured, broken bones from accidents, burns from vehicle fires, chronic health problems from breathing diesel fumes for 20 hours a day, hearing loss from constant engine noise, mental exhaustion that today would be recognized as a form of combat stress, but then was just expected, just part of the job. One driver, a man named Samuel Jackson from Louisiana, he was interviewed in the 1980s. By then he was in his 60s, working as a mechanic in Shreveport. He said, "People ask me what I did in the war. I tell them I drove a truck. They say, 'Oh, supply, that must have been safe.' I don't argue with them. But I remember driving 20 hours straight, hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. I remember my best friend dying when his truck overturned in the rain. I remember feeling like I was going to die every single day, not from Germans, but just from exhaustion, from the sheer physical impossibility of what they were asking us to do. But we did it anyway, because somebody had to." The pharmacological aspect of the Red Ball Express is something historians have started examining more closely in recent years. Benzedrine, amphetamines, they were distributed to drivers regularly, not secretly or shamefully, but a standard practice, to keep men awake for those 20-hour shifts, to maintain alertness when every instinct said to sleep. The long-term health consequences we can only guess at, but in the moment it was seen as necessary. Another example of American willingness to accept costs, in this case human health costs, that Germans wouldn't. The Wehrmacht used stimulants too, of course, but more sparingly, more carefully. The Americans used them like they used fuel, abundantly, assuming the human body could take it, and if it couldn't, there were more drivers. It sounds callous, maybe it was, but it was also effective. And effectiveness in August and September 1944 was the only metric that mattered. Let me tell you about one particular night, September 11th, 1944. There's a convoy of 200 trucks moving east toward Nancy, where Patton's forces are engaged in heavy fighting. They're carrying 105mm artillery shells, desperately needed. The guns are almost out of ammunition. The convoy is led by a sergeant named William Davis. He's been driving for 18 hours already. His eyes are burning. His hands are cramping on the wheel. He's hallucinating, seeing German soldiers that aren't there, seeing obstacles on the road that don't exist. Behind him, 199 other trucks, other drivers in the same condition. Some of them have been awake for 40 hours straight. They're taking benzedrine to stay alert, but there's a limit to what the drug can do. Around midnight, they hit fog, thick fog, the kind where you can't see 10 feet ahead. German doctrine would have been to stop, wait for dawn, proceed safely. The Red Ball Express doctrine was keep moving. Davis slowed to 15 miles per hour, put his headlights on high, leaned forward in his seat, straining to see the road. Behind him, the convoy did the same. For 6 hours they drove through that fog. 3 trucks overturned, 1 driver died, 2 were seriously injured. But 197 trucks reached Nancy at dawn. The artillery shells were unloaded in 30 minutes. The guns started firing again by 7 a.m. A German counterattack that morning was broken by that artillery. Patton's forces held their positions. The advance continued. Was it worth it? 3 trucks destroyed, 1 man dead, 2 injured, to deliver ammunition that might have arrived 12 hours later if they'd waited for the fog to clear? The American calculation said yes. The German calculation would have said no. And that difference, multiplied across thousands of decisions, decided the war. The relationships between drivers, that's another story worth telling. These men, they formed bonds that lasted their entire lives. When you've been through what they went through together, hallucinating from exhaustion, keeping each other awake, pulling each other from wrecked vehicles, sharing rations, sharing benzedrine, sharing everything, you don't forget those people. There were Red Ball Express reunions for decades after the war. Men who'd driven together would gather, tell stories, remember friends who didn't make it home. Some of these men, they saw each other more than they saw their own families in the years after the war. One reunion in 1964, the 20th anniversary, had over 2,000 veterans attend in Chicago. Men came from all over the country, white drivers and black drivers together, which was still unusual in 1964 America. But the Red Ball Express had created bonds that lasted their entire lives, at least for those who'd lived it. A white driver from Georgia, a man named Tom Wilson, he stood up at that reunion and said, "I grew up in a place and time where I was taught that white and colored couldn't be equals, couldn't be friends. The Red Ball Express taught me different. The man who saved my life when my truck caught fire was colored. The man who kept me awake when I was falling asleep at the wheel was colored. The man whose funeral I went to when he died in '62, who I cried at his grave like he was my brother, was colored. The Red Ball changed me, changed a lot of us. Maybe that's part of what we won in that war." Now, let's talk about what happened to the Red Ball Express infrastructure after the operation ended in November 1944. The trucks, the fuel dumps, the maintenance stations, the temporary cities. What happened to all of it? The trucks that survived were redistributed to other units. Some went to other theater operations, some were sold to Allied nations, some were abandoned in France, eventually purchased by French civilians who used them for agriculture, for commercial transport, for whatever purpose they needed. You could still see former Red Ball Express trucks operating in rural France into the 1960s. GMC 2.5-ton trucks, repainted, repurposed, but still running. Those engines, they were built to last. Even under Red Ball conditions, the basic design was sound enough that with proper maintenance, the kind the Red Ball never gave them, they could run for decades. The fuel dumps were dismantled, the fuel transferred to permanent installations or consumed by advancing armies. The maintenance stations were packed up, equipment moved forward to where the front lines now stood. The temporary cities for drivers, the tent complexes and barracks, they disappeared almost overnight. The French civilians who'd watched the Red Ball Express operate for months, who'd seen this enormous American machine function at impossible intensity, they woke up one morning in late November and it was just gone, like it had never been there, except for the road damage, the abandoned trucks, and the memories. One French farmer near Chartres said in an interview years later, "For 3 months my fields were surrounded by American trucks, day and night, the noise, the smell of diesel, the dust. I thought I would hate it, but there was something magnificent about it, the energy, the determination. Then one day, silence. They were gone. The war moved east without them. I almost missed the noise." The Red Ball Express had done its job. Railways were operational again, supply lines were shorter, the operation was no longer necessary, so it ended. Simple as that. But the lessons, the innovations, the proof of concept, those didn't end. Those became doctrine. After the war, the United States military studied the Red Ball Express intensively. What worked, what didn't, what could be improved. The findings revolutionized American military logistics for the Cold War era. The concept of continuous, high-volume supply became standard. The idea of accepting high vehicle attrition rates in exchange for speed became accepted practice. The understanding that logistics determined strategy, not the other way around, became foundational. When the Berlin airlift happened in 1948, the Americans applied Red Ball Express principles to the air. Continuous flights, priority on volume over efficiency, acceptance of risks that would have been unthinkable before. And it worked. The Soviets couldn't believe it would work, but it did. When the Korean War started in 1950, American logistics operations in theater were based on Red Ball Express principles, adapted to different terrain. High volume, continuous supply, acceptance of waste in pursuit of speed, decentralized decision-making. The Germans had one more education to receive about the Red Ball Express. In the 1950s, when West Germany was being rearmed as part of NATO, German officers were sent to American military schools. They studied American doctrine, and they had to study the Red Ball as a case study in logistics. Imagine that. German officers, some of whom had fought against the Red Ball, now learning how it worked from the inside, learning the principles, learning why it succeeded when they were so certain it would fail. One such officer, a man named Hans Schmidt, who'd been a lieutenant in 1944 and was now a colonel in the Bundeswehr, the new German army, he wrote in 1957, "We are taught to plan carefully, to conserve resources, to move methodically. The Americans teach us to move fast, to overwhelm problems with resources, to accept chaos as part of success. It goes against everything in my training, but I cannot argue with the results. They won. We lost. Perhaps that's lesson enough." The racial dimension of the Red Ball Express continued to reverberate through American society for decades. The men who drove those trucks came home to an America that was still deeply segregated, still deeply racist in many places. They'd proven themselves equal to any soldiers. They'd performed miracles. They'd contributed decisively to victory. And they came home to the back of the bus, to segregated facilities, to discrimination in employment and housing. The cognitive dissonance, it was profound, not just for them, but for the nation. How do you celebrate victory in a war against racist fascism when your own society is racist? How do you honor soldiers who fought for freedom when they don't have full freedom at home? The answer was, awkwardly and slowly. The Red Ball Express veterans became part of the broader civil rights movement. Not all of them, certainly, but many. They had proof that they were equal. They delivered that proof at 35 miles per hour across France. They weren't going to accept second-class citizenship quietly. One veteran, a man named Robert Johnson, became a civil rights organizer in Mississippi in the 1960s. He was arrested during a sit-in in 1963. The sheriff, a white man who'd also served in World War II, recognized him. Said, "You're that driver, aren't you? Red Ball Express. I read about you people." Johnson replied, "That's right. I drove supplies to your army in France. I was good enough to keep your war moving. Now you're telling me I'm not good enough to eat at this lunch counter? You explain that to me." The sheriff couldn't. He let Johnson go. Didn't drop the charges, but let him go. Sometimes the contradictions were just too obvious to ignore. President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, Executive Order 9981. The Red Ball Express wasn't the only reason, but it was part of the evidence that made the order inevitable. You couldn't maintain that black soldiers were inferior when they just won a war through their contributions. The Red Ball Express had demonstrated something that couldn't be undone. Competence doesn't care about race. Performance doesn't care about skin color. Given equal opportunity, outcomes are equal, sometimes more than equal. That lesson, it took America decades to truly learn, but the evidence was there, driven across France in 1944 by men who refused to be limited by other people's prejudices. Let's talk about the numbers one more time, because they're staggering even now, 80 years later. 412,193 tons of supplies. That's 824 million pounds. If you loaded that into modern semi-trucks, you'd need over 40,000 truckloads. The Red Ball did it with 6,000 trucks, making multiple trips. 222 million ton miles. That's the equivalent of moving 1 ton 222 million miles, or moving 222 million tons 1 mile. The computational magnitude of the logistics is difficult to even conceptualize. 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily just to operate the trucks, not the fuel being delivered, just the fuel used by the operation itself. That's enough fuel to supply a modern American city for a day. And they did this for 82 days straight. Not working hours, not business days. 82 days of continuous 24-hour operation. The German General Staff, when they finally had access to all the records after the war, they did their own analysis. Their conclusion, published in a 1950s military history journal, was blunt. The RBE achieved logistical performance that exceeded theoretical maximum by every calculation we possessed. This is impossible according to our doctrine, yet it occurred. We must revise our understanding of logistics or excedentary science. They chose to revise their understanding. NATO logistics doctrine today bears the marks of lessons learned from the Red Ball Express. There's a philosophical dimension to this story that's worth exploring. The Red Ball Express represented a fundamentally different approach to problem solving than the German method. German military science was about optimization, finding the most efficient solution, minimizing waste, maximizing output per unit input, careful planning, methodical execution. American practice, at least in the Red Ball Express, was about maximization, finding the solution that delivered the most output, period, accepting waste as a cost, prioritizing speed over efficiency, rapid planning or no planning, chaotic but effective execution. Neither approach is inherently better. In a world of scarcity, optimization makes sense. In a world of abundance, maximization makes sense. The Germans were fighting a war of scarcity. They had limited resources, limited industry, limited fuel, limited everything after years of war. The Americans were fighting a war of abundance. They had Detroit. They had Texas oil fields. They had a continent untouched by bombing. They had industrial capacity beyond anything the world had ever seen. The Red Ball Express was abundance in motion. It was America saying, we have so much that we can afford to waste half of it and still overwhelm you. That's not tactics. That's not strategy. That's civilization-level competition. And the Germans lost that competition before the first shot was fired. The Red Ball Express just made it visible. There's a museum now in Normandy that has a small exhibit on the Red Ball Express. Photographs of drivers, a restored GMC 2.5-ton truck, maps showing the routes, statistics on the walls. Visitors, American and German and French and from all over the world, they stand there and look at those numbers. 412,193 tons, 222 million ton miles, 82 days, 23,000 drivers. And you can see them trying to comprehend it, trying to visualize 6,000 trucks rolling continuously, trying to imagine the noise, the scale, the audacity of it all. The exhibit includes a quote from General Patton, large on the wall. The Red Ball Express won the war as surely as any rifle company. Next to it, a quote from a German general, name not given. We prepared to fight an army. We discovered we were fighting a factory. That's the story, really. That's what the Red Ball Express proved. Modern war isn't about armies fighting armies. It's about industrial systems competing. The side with the better system, the more productive system, the more resilient system, that side wins. The Germans had excellent soldiers, brilliant generals, superior tactics in many ways, but they were fighting with a system designed for scarcity, and they faced an opponent with a system designed for abundance. The Red Ball Express was abundance made manifest. 6,000 trucks, driven by men who weren't supposed to be capable of it, performing miracles that weren't supposed to be possible, winning a war that the Germans thought they understood. 82 days. That's all it took to break the Wehrmacht's back in France. Not 82 days of combat, though there was plenty of that. 82 days of trucks, rolling day and night, feeding an army that moved too fast for the textbooks, advancing at speeds that shouldn't have been sustainable, winning through logistics rather than tactics. The German generals stopped laughing somewhere around the end of August 1944. By September, they weren't laughing at all. By October, they were studying the Red Ball Express, trying to understand how they'd been so wrong. By May 1945, they were surrendering, finally comprehending that they'd lost to something they'd never prepared for. Trucks. Just trucks. Driven by men they'd been taught to despise, organized in ways that violated every principle they'd learned, succeeding through methods they'd dismissed as impossible. That's the story of the Red Ball Express. Not the story they taught you in school, probably. Not the glamorous part of World War II, but maybe the most important part, the part that actually decided the outcome. Because wars aren't won by heroes, really. Wars are won by logistics, by supply lines, by thousands of men doing unglamorous work, driving trucks, loading cargo, maintaining vehicles, staying awake when every instinct says to sleep, keeping the system moving when the system shouldn't be able to move. The Red Ball Express kept moving. For 82 days, it kept moving. And that made all the difference. So, if you found this story fascinating, if this kind of deep dive into military history is your thing, there's plenty more where this came from. Matter of fact, I've got a video about how Nazi Germany wasted the jet that could have changed history. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.